Tao and the Cosmic Principle. Chapter 4. The Mechanisms of the Cosmos and the Tao. Physical Principles that Support Life. Atomic Structure. In Chapter 4, I propose a hypothesis concerning the relationship between the cosmos and human beings, something that has been discussed in Eastern philosophy since ancient times. Traditional Eastern wisdom has viewed human beings as microcosms corresponding to the macrocosmos. I would now like to consider to what extent the thoughts of the ancient Eastern sages align with the principles of the cosmos. This discussion focuses on whether the laws of the cosmos and the process by which human beings are born and live their lives are equal in principle. In addition, I will also discuss whether we can assume that the human mind, the fundamental structure of the universe, and creation and nurturing fundamentally function in the same way. I would like to examine this by looking at the structure of the cosmos. Let us begin from an understanding of the basic atomic structure in physics. According to physics, humanity's position within the universe can be quantified thus. Together with Earth, we are positioned right in the middle between 10 to the minus 20th power meters, limit at 10 to the minus 36th power meters, which is a smaller scale than the electroweak unification scale in the microscopic world, and 10 to the 28th power meters at the cosmic cliffs in the macro world. This impresses upon us something that is difficult to describe as mere coincidence. It seems to me that there is some manner of blueprint, produced by some kind of will, that moves in and out of view. At the very least, it reinforces the view that the universe was built around humans. Materialists, however, are thorough in their claim that this is all mere coincidence, and ultimately meaningless. This notion should be respected as one of notions. However, if we view reality in a normal sense, the Anthropic Principle solution seems to be a very natural consequence. Let us revisit the atomic structure. I have already explained something of this in Chapter 1 of this book, but allow me to elaborate further. Some people mistakenly believe atoms to be fixed objects, and purely inorganic, but everything, from the ground to the rocks to the oceans, to the sky, and all organic organisms, plants, animals, as well as us humans, is composed of atoms. If we further divide cells, to view them at their most basic, we find they are made up of atoms. Furthermore, atoms are no longer the smallest unit. They are divided into smaller fundamental units, elementary particles. As I have already mentioned, the part that forms the core of the atom is called a nucleus, also known as a nucleon. As shown in the figure, a nucleus consists of protons and neutrons. Protons carry a positive charge, plus. Neutrons, as their name implies, carry no charge. In other words, they are called neutrons, because they carry zero charge, and are therefore neutral. These carry neither a positive, plus, nor a negative, minus charge. With the exception of the hydrogen nucleus, which consists of a single proton, plus, the nucleus of every atom consists of protons, plus, and neutrons. Tiny electrons, minus, trace an orbit around the nucleus. Electrons carry a negative, minus charge, while the nucleus carries a positive, plus charge of protons, and so the principle of magnetism works to attract each other. If we take the mass of a proton to be 1, an electron is about 1/1840th that size. As such, both electrons and nucleus united as one, is called atom. Incidentally, if we take helium as an example, compare the size of the atom with the size of the nucleus at its center, and take the size of the atom to be the size of the circle of the Yamanote line in Tokyo, 11 kilometers in diameter, the nucleus would be extremely small, about the size of a volleyball, 20 centimeters in diameter, with electrons the size of sesame seeds, whizzing around it, and nothing in between, creating a gaping structure. It is closer to the truth to say that there is almost nothing. Therefore, as described in Chapter 1, if we were not repelled from the ground by the electromagnetic force of electrons, minus, we would be sucked down into the ground by the force of gravity. The number of protons is also the atomic number of that atom. This is the order of atoms, from light to heavy, and is also the order in which they were produced in the universe. Thus, hydrogen has a single proton, because it takes atomic number 1, while helium has 2 protons, and hence takes atomic number 2. Each atom has an equal number of positively plus charged protons, and negatively minus charged electrons, and so, the atom as a whole is neutral. In other words, does not carry a positive or negative electric charge. The type of atom depends on the number of protons and electrons it contains. In other words, it is this that determines the nature of a material. Put simply, that is all there is to say, but when I consider this carefully, I am almost petrified by this awesomeness. Is this true of you, reader? The simplicity of this principle staggers me. The ease with which different substances can be produced, simply by increasing the number of protons. Is it not dumbfounding? There is no way that all the matter in the universe could have been created by such a simple principle. However, the captivating mysteries of the cosmos can only leave one stunned. It is interesting that it is for this reason that materialists claim there is no God, while believers, whether theist or deist, argue this to be the work of God. These different perspectives are in such polar opposition as to be almost funny, and this is something of deep interest when analyzing humanity. Atheists, in this case, speak in language of intelligence, while uneducated believers speak language of emotion, and those that are educated speak a language of reason. The notion of God's work does not arise here in language of wisdom or above. This is because from the outset, all of nature is captured in this way. The number of an atom's protons added to the number of its neutrons is called the mass number of that atom. Helium atoms have 2 protons and 2 neutrons, and so their mass number is 4. The above is written as figure 1. The atomic number is written on the bottom left of the element symbol, while the mass number is shown on the top left. Atoms are electrically neutral, because of the balance in their positive and negative charges. However, some atoms are prone to losing electrons, and others to receiving them. For example, sodium atoms are susceptible to losing electrons, while chlorine atoms are prone to receiving them. Figure 2. Thus, when chlorine receives an electron from sodium, the entire atom gains a negative charge, while the sodium atom takes on a positive charge. The chlorine and sodium atoms attract each other, combining to form sodium chloride. This creates salt. Figure 3. Thus, even simple atomic structures demonstrate diversity, using miraculous changes to create new compounds. These chemical changes occur because protons and electrons carry positive and negative charges, respectively. This is precisely nothing other than the action of yin and yang, as described in Eastern philosophy. The wondrously simple principle of matter. According to the latest research, the structure of the atomic model everyone knows has been slightly modified. The figure on the bottom right shows the conventional model of the atomic nucleus structure as we have understood it until now. However, as shown in the figure on the top right, protons and neutrons are separate from one another, and these are constantly replacing one another within the nucleus. What you thought was a proton is a neutron. What you thought was a neutron is a proton, and so on, in a constant pattern of replacement. The nucleons that compose an atom's nucleus, associated with the beta decay phenomenon described later, behave in truly unusual ways. This principle is also consistent with the Buddhist principle of momentary generation and annihilation. Moreover, although the time scales differ greatly, the principle of alternating destruction and rebirth within the double helix structure of DNA also appears to be fundamentally the same action. We should thus be surprised by the fact that matter consists fundamentally solely of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Just as how organisms are formed from different sequences of the same 4 genetic bases, all matter is created through the combination of 3 elementary particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons, or a nucleon and an electron. We also know that there are much smaller units further inside, called quarks, which make up protons and neutrons. Protons are formed from 3 quarks, 2 up quarks, 2/3 e electric charge, and 1 down quark, -1/3 e, while neutrons are the opposite, formed from 3 quarks, consisting of 1 up quark, and 2 down quarks. As a result, the proton has a positive charge, while the neutron carries no charge. Note that antiparticles are present in all of them. Quarks come together in groups of 3 to form composite particles, divisible hadrons, which make protons and neutrons. And electrons, one of the leptons, which is considered to be the indivisible smallest unit, orbit around them. Thus, an atom consists of protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are the only fundamental building blocks of all matter. In other words, all matter, atoms, is made up of only 2 elementary particles: quarks and electrons. As I have said many times, it is truly amazing. However, Eastern philosophy has long known, from before the Common Era, BCE, of the fundamental principle of fluctuation associated with this principle. We should humbly bow our heads to this fact. We should be respectful of it. It is improper for rational persons to disparagingly dismiss the Eastern study of divination as superstition or unscientific. In that sense, Jung was a truly superb scholar of psychology. Regardless, if you rearrange atoms, you can create any and all matter. This is remarkable. It should be no surprise, however, if you understand the principle of I Ching. In other words, it is theoretically straightforward to create new life by modifying base sequences, and it is theoretically easy to create any kind of matter at will. This opens up a range of possibilities of such breadth that nothing is impossible in this world. In the distant future, perhaps it will become possible to transform the skin of one's body into steel at will. The interaction of 4 forces. We know that the inner space of protons and neutrons cannot be measured, but particles, quarks, constantly appear and disappear. In fact, it is thanks to this that we exist. From our common sense, it is inconceivable that human beings are composed of matter that generates and annihilates, but in fact, this mysterious phenomenon is what activates human cells, and prevents them from becoming immobilized, dead. Since it is said that matter also exists as a living object, due to the properties of these mysterious elementary particles, the quantum world, elementary particles, is a world utterly incomprehensible to human common sense. However, since this is the case, we must accept it as it is. Its structure seems entirely absurd. Then again, most of a proton's mass does not come from quarks, but rather from a fluctuating virtual field that appears and disappears, and so the world unfolds more like that of a video game than the real world. The world inside an atom's nucleus is structured in a way that can only be called a virtual field, and mysterious nucleons are controlled by the mysterious forces in that field. Thanks to the virtual field, mass is created. The nucleus is made stable, and objects, including ourselves, exist. We can see that the fundamental principle of fluctuation continues to operate therein, whereby the fundamental primordial substance Prakriti, taikyoku, arises from the pure spirit of Purusha, mukyoku. This fundamental principle governs all existence, and guides all of us. As I have said before, in Buddhism, this is called setsunametsu, the momentary generation and annihilation, and is the most fundamental doctrine in the ontology of Buddhist philosophy. This is the definitive principle that one cannot say one knows Buddhism without understanding it. It speaks to the minute displacements, fluctuations, of birth, stability, change, and annihilation, while at the same time having developed into the temporal ontology known as Sansa Jitsu, the teaching of the 3 temporal states of reality, which I will discuss later. Indeed, existing on a scale far smaller than that of a proton, is the Higgs boson. This is what gives mass to all things, with a few exceptions such as photons, gravitons, etc. Sitting in a Higgs field, the Higgs boson entwines itself with other elementary particles, creating weight and electricity. It is as yet unknown why some particles have mass, and some do not, but I believe this to have been a condition for life to come into being. It is more persuasive to say that everything is inclined toward an affirmation of human existence, than the explanation provided by atheists. Why the Higgs boson exists remains a mystery. This is because, it seems, that elementary particles may have possessed mass from the outset. Why the Higgs boson is such a tiny size, is a new question, but I imagine it is probably because it had to be so fine to entangle the elementary particles. This is one of the great mysteries of our existence. Once you understand how gravity works, however, you will begin to understand. I have already discussed how gravity is the force that rules the macrocosmos. The force of gravity is transmitted by hypothetical elementary particles, known as gravitons. What a surprise, that granular particles are gravity's true form. Common sense truly has no place in the quantum realm. I think this may be a surprise to this book's readers. On Earth, it is a force that acts to cause things to fall. It acts as the force that binds the moon to the Earth. It is what used to be called universal gravitation. Since it is not given mass by Higgs bosons, it can transmit its power throughout the infinite universe. Similarly, it is electromagnetic force that generates electricity, by exchanging photons, which also have no mass. As with gravity, the force is transmitted infinitely, but unlike gravity, it also acts inside the microscopic atoms. It is photons, light quanta, that transmit this power. I have already stated that this electromagnetic force, the repulsive force of electrons, is what brings protons and electrons together, and is a physical force we experience in our day-to-day lives. These two forces, electromagnetic force and gravity, are involved in everything we experience in our day-to-day lives. Sensations on the skin, hard, soft, etc., are electromagnetic forces themselves. Moreover, two other forces work on a smaller scale, within atoms' nuclei. These are called the strong force, strong interaction, and the weak force, weak interaction. The strong force is the strongest force in nature that works between quarks, acting to bind protons and neutrons together, within the nucleus, to prevent the nucleus from breaking apart, and also acting to bind three quarks together within hadrons, in other words, protons and neutrons. This is known as strong interaction, or strong nuclear force. Elementary particles, known as gluons, transmit this force. The strong force is about 137 times stronger than the electromagnetic force, about 10 to the 6th power times stronger than the weak force, about 1,000,000 times, and about 10 to the 38th power times stronger than the force of gravity, about 100 undecillion times. However, this force is peculiar in that its action is very limited, within a range of 10 to the -15th power meters. In short, it acts only within the nucleus of an atom, and there are no macroscopic effects at all. On the other hand, the weak force, also called the weak interaction, or weak nuclear force, is transmitted solely within the nucleus, by elementary particles called weak bosons, within a range of 10 to the -17th power meters. The weak force switches neutrons and protons, known as beta decay. Beta decay is a phenomenon, in which an atomic nucleus emits beta particles, electrons, neutrinos, and antineutrinos, resulting in another nucleus. There are two types of beta decay, beta- decay, in which a neutron emits a beta- particle, electron, and an antineutrino, transforming into a proton, and increasing in atomic number by 1, and beta+ decay, a phenomenon in which a proton emits a beta+ particle, positron, and a neutrino, and becomes a neutron. Its atomic number decreases by 1. In beta- decay, a negatively charged electron is emitted from a neutron, so the remaining neutron gains a positive charge, becoming a proton. Beta+ decay works in the opposite direction. A positively charged electron is emitted from the proton, so the resulting proton loses its positive charge, becoming a neutron. In other words, the weak force operates between subatomic particles, such as quarks and leptons, to cause the radioactive decay of atoms. This force is particularly important, in that it causes the fusion of hydrogen into helium, and this reaction powers the thermonuclear process of the Sun. In short, the strong force is the force that stabilizes a nucleus, while the weak force is the interaction that causes a quark to turn into a different quark. Of course, it also acts to break the symmetry of electrical charge, giving rise to myriad substances and phenomena. This role is extremely important. We feel gravitational and electromagnetic forces because they act over long distances, while we do not feel the action of the strong force or the weak force, because they only act at the scale of the nucleus of an atom. The reason for this is the Higgs boson. These two forces are affected by the Higgs boson, and can only act across the distance of the nucleus of an atom. Electromagnetic force, photons, and gravity, gravitons, on the other hand, do not involve Higgs bosons, and consequently have no mass. Because these particles have no mass, their force is transmitted over long distances. These forces manifest themselves freely in space. It is surprising that, of the four forces, the force we know best, gravity, is the weakest. If we look to the really quite exquisite mechanisms of the cosmos, it is almost impossible to imagine that this is all merely a product of chance. The atheists who claim this is a coincidence are simply being obtuse. This is because we cannot help but think that some kind of cosmic will is at work very cleverly. The Anthropic Principle. Are there any believers in a cosmic religion? This field of physics is highly interesting. This is because it says that if so inclined, you could create any kind of matter. If we apply this notion to the Anthropic Principle, we may take it to mean that we can innovate and transform our consciousness through our own action or effort. This is the same logic as genetic recombination. In that sense, physics is very interesting. The question of this field, the problem of fluctuation, should never be taken lightly. In other words, it is necessary to understand that this is a physical law that shows that we contain unlimited possibilities. What I am attempting to convey here is that the principles of the atom are almost equivalent to those of people, but unfortunately, when I say this to some scientists, they are too prejudiced to comprehend it. Unfortunately, many scientists versed in language of intelligence seem yet to have reached that point. This is especially true of Japanese scholars and intellectuals. Surprisingly, however, I feel that some European scholars might understand. Until very recently, no scientist acknowledged a multidimensional universe. In fact, until a few decades ago, the study of the singularity was itself considered to be folly. Superstring theory, which has discussed supersymmetry, was not acknowledged as physics, and was not taken seriously. The first proponent of the theory was driven to suicide at a young age, by the cold stare of the world. What is more, were you to go back 100 years, no one would have accepted atoms as a unit of the world. Moreover, while everyone has thus far only acknowledged 4 dimensions, and thought that was the limit, physicists today believe in the existence of multidimensional worlds. Were I to have said such a thing 40 or 50 years ago, I would have been called ignorant, or an occultist. This would have been true, even 20 to 30 years ago. I do not quite understand why this kind of injurious smear is always used, but some physicists seem to be repeating others' mistakes, rejecting the existence of a cosmic will, without reflecting on the mistakes they themselves have made. These will perhaps be revealed in time, however. We are simply waiting for a suitably brilliant physicist to emerge. Scientists are split over whether to accept or reject the existence of a God. On the surface, however, they all deny it. Strictly speaking, scholars do not accept any god of religion. Particularly because of historical circumstances, they fundamentally reject the Christian notion of a personal God. However, and as described earlier, Planck, who created the foundations of quantum theory, earning himself a Nobel Prize in the process, was a man of faith. In his pursuit of physical principles, he, on the contrary, gained a sense of the existence of a God, and his faith was strengthened. Though few in number, probably, a certain number of scientists affirm their current religion like Planck. The rest of the scientists can be classified into 2 types, the Einsteinian type, which is completely opposed to Christianity, and the Yukawa Hideki, Schrödinger, and Wolfgang Ernst Pauli type, which is rooted in Eastern philosophy. As yet, few scholars believe in what Einstein termed cosmic religion. What would have been considered ignorance in the past, has come to be considered obvious by everyone. This is rather splendid. We have come to an age in which what Buddhist philosophy has been saying for the past 2,500 years has at last gained scientific acceptance. Unfortunately, however, what I will go on to say is something scientists still brand ignorant. In any case, human cosmology will continue to be discussed in terms of the relationship between the vast and small, between the cosmos and humanity. In the next section, I will analyze the four forces, with the intent of clarifying this. As this is an important point of view that I will discuss up to Chapter 6, I would like to give this careful consideration. Microcosmos, the four forces that act to rule humanity. I would now like to analyze the four forces in relation to the Anthropic Principle. I will discuss this in greater depth in Chapter 6, but because it is an extremely important perspective, I will first summarize it here. Gravity equals a historical and social force. The cosmos is shaped by gravity. Indeed, all matter consists of the electromagnetic force, the strong force, and the weak force. Note that this structure is highly suggestive in the analysis of human spirituality. In short, this structure can be described as follows. In other words, it is a human analysis as a structure, when an atom is considered to be a single human. First, let us begin from the atomic nucleus. The strong interaction and the weak interaction, to which the adhesive Higgs boson clings, can be understood as the self, ego, as a spirit. This is the action of forming an inner consciousness as the nucleus of an atom, self. It is a force from within, and is a consciousness concerned only with oneself. This could be called a strong attachment to the self. Strictly speaking, this means that there is an action that splits into protons and neutrons, and we must understand its necessity. The result of this reflection would seem to be the eternal theme of humanity, a consciousness of good and evil that dominates our own minds, that is to say, good and bad intentions, hearts of honesty, and hearts of lies. Reading this, you may wonder whether this means that protons are good and neutrons are bad. This is not the case. What I am saying is that the phenomenon of yin and yang manifests itself as a result of the duality principle, and that this phenomenon also appears in the form of good and evil in the human mind. This is the same as the binary principle in computing. It is usually considered as the action of light and dark, strong and weak, dynamic and static. If we analyze it this way, evil actions are an essential element in order to exist in this world. It is a little distasteful from my point of view, but such is the solution that we derive. Given that Buddhist philosophy describes existence as the inability to reach enlightenment and suffering, we have derived the right solution. This will be discussed in more detail in Chapter 5, in the section, The Mundane and the Sacred. Moreover, if we apply a gravitational action that forms galaxies, and creates stars and planets to humans, it can be transposed as a historical social force, of civilization, culture, politics, the economy, and fashion. It is an irresistible external force that affects you. Indeed, the electromagnetic force, which acts only between particles, with an electric charge positioned between gravity and weak, strong force, could be said to be what connects us to others. It seems that this principle is precisely related to human encounters and relationships. This can be broadly separated into cases of a relational consciousness action between protons and electrons, and an external consciousness action, a contact, involvement, between my electrons, atoms, and others' electrons, atoms. Such is this action. Family relations, romance, etc., are positional actions within atoms, as relational consciousness. In fact, when we act macroscopically, and relate to others, the world, what is at work, is a relationship at the atomic periphery, exerted through the force of minus electrons. I have already described how this power allows us to stand on the ground, and to shake hands. Electromagnetic force equals love and hate. Thus, the electromagnetic force, that emerges in relationships with others, is generated by the interactions between protons and electrons, in the form of the exchange of photons, and this describes interactions between families and lovers. Moreover, it is photons that intercede here. In this book, I analyze photons as love or affection. In other words, the principle of the action of electromagnetic force in human law is the exchange of love in the human world, sometimes becoming hate through variations in electrical charge. Hence, human relationships are not a bargain for profit or loss, but are essentially an intention toward peace, through the exchange of affection. This is quite important, and, in fact, the principle of attraction occurs in atoms as well, where electromagnetic forces are caused by the exchange of photons between protons and electrons. This is truly very interesting. It is noticed that this is exactly the same structure as the exchange of affection between human beings. In my opinion, photons can be fully understood as a concept that refers to affection. This creates an attractive force, both in objects and in people. The love between parent and child, and romance are the best examples of this, but there is often a lack of balance in the spirit, power, which acts in the opposite direction. Atomically speaking, this seems to be because of the law of beta decay, and action associated with the change in charge between nucleons and electrons. Relations with third parties are based on the repulsive force between one's own electrons and those of the other party. This is why relationships with others cause most of life's problems. From those relationships, when special friendships and loves arise, the electrons of others seem to be transferred to those in one's own atom. It is from this point on that they become persons closest to us. In fact, electrons can escape from atoms and enter other atoms. This type of relationship is also extremely rare, but is a similar phenomenon. What is at work here is photons as electromagnetic force and love, and sometimes repellent hatred. In this sense, the electromagnetic force signifies the exchange of emotions with others, at times creating relations of affection, sometimes indifference, and sometimes hatred. Moreover, the electrons involved there are nothing more than the action, organ, of contact with others. This is simply a relationship that is separated into relatives, persons closest to you, and outsiders. The existence of the self, including those relations, is the atom, and the ego that forms its core is the nucleon. When we try to act more socially, it seems to me that the state of being buffeted by history, ideology, and political and economic world, is the phase transition of the principle of gravitational force onto human society. Gravity broadly refers to influence in the world. While the electromagnetic force, which possesses the same infinite influence, implies an association only with people possessing a particular electrical charge, gravitational force is the action common to the whole society. Everyone is dependent on the earth, ruled by their state, and bound and involved as a member of their society. None of us is immune to the effects of politics and economy. Victims of war and natural disasters are prime examples of this. In an individual, consciousness as an action within nucleon governs the self and our egos with the greatest force, but in our lives, we are swept up by the gravitational action of state-level power. This is the form gravity takes when it engages with the human world. The action of these four forces as they pertain to human beings can be reduced to the term shujaku, attachment. Strong force equals ego and self-affirmation. What is this strong force that combines quarks and binds protons and neutrons into nucleon? It seems to be the very essence of human attachment. This could also be called instinct for surviving, and it is also consciousness of self-preservation. The consciousness of self-preservation is extremely self-centered. It is a strong attachment to this world that we all carry in our hearts. This could be called the power, spirit, to perceive existence itself, including oneself and others as absolute. It is this very nature that governs us as an irresistible force, no matter how much social influence or force of relationships put upon it. This might be rephrased as foolishness, mumyo, avidya, ignorance. Obsession with oneself is exactly the action of this strong force. All life exists in a self-centered and egoistic way. Whatever the situation, one's mind is at the center. This is our selfishness. This is the action of the strong force as an identity that is attached to the oneself, and that finds the self. Weak force equals ego, self-denial, and change. What, then, is the weak force? This is the giving up, or change of heart, we invariably experience in order to progress to what is next. Sometimes it is a parting to progress to the next. It is also change caused by one's own desires. Be it active or passive, the weak force seems to have an intercessory effect on the mind as a herald of change. At a glance, it appears weak. It is not always in opposition to someone else. However, it can be interpreted as a force of consciousness that acts to either vaguely or decisively reject one's past self and past situations and open up a new self, a new world. This is an awareness that appears suddenly, in the corner of one's mind, is different from the intense attachments of the self that constantly act upon the self, and is separate from one's usual, constant self. As if in contradiction to the absolute, self-affirming strong force principle, this weak force principle is a force that confronts the self in a self-denying way. It is also an action that causes fusion with others internally. Since it is complementary to strong consciousness as the action of strong force, if the balance is broken, and the weak action of consciousness is strengthened, self-denial will increase, and mental stability will be lost. Depression is a typical example. Conversely, if weak force acts only weakly, strong consciousness as the action of strong force will dominate the individual excessively, forming an arrogant personality. This is the emergence of what is commonly called a self-centered personality. Thus, there is an inherent weak force self that is constantly changing. There is a shifting self within everyone's heart. This is also the unconsciousness that tries to take something as acute a change. Just as protons and neutrons suddenly emit electrons and neutrinos, because of beta decay, people also relinquish the obsession they have accumulated in their own hearts, which is an extremely important action for the strength to take steps toward a new life. That sometimes creates a feeling of transience that is peculiar to the Japanese, and brings out a kind of wabi feeling. Above all, there is the consciousness of being obsessed and attached to oneself as a strong force. This is the core of who I am. There is that self that stubbornly does not accept others, whatever anyone tries to say. A powerful egoistic self reigns there, with an overwhelming power. This is mumyo, avidya, ignorance in Buddhism, the root of distracting thoughts, and the power of gyo, samsara, which is formative power of karma. This is such a piteous and fierce ego, that nothing else can resist it. In Buddhism, this is called bonpu, prathaggyana, or foolish person. Western-style positive thinking is the idea of the dominance of the strong force, and it is clear that it is not always correct, as can be seen from the principles clarified here. In the West, there seems to be a tendency toward completely denying negative thinking as false thoughts, but as shown here, it is clearly a mistake. Western, i.e., contemporary civilization, positive thinking is a form of violent affirmative thinking, in which there is a schema, where strong attackers are good, and weak attackers are bad. They are the kind to assert themselves, and live on the premise of not acknowledging any disadvantages, whatsoever for themselves. These are characteristics of Western culture as represented by President Trump's America, highly individualistic, France, or Italy, which does not know how to apologize. However, this is generally the same throughout the world, and in the Middle East, China, and South Korea, such assertions may be even stronger than in America. This idea will be described in more specific terms in Chapter 6. It is necessary to learn that there are deeper meanings hidden in these principles.